Okay, can you hear me back there? Is the microphone working? Welcome. My name is George Roderick, and I'm in environmental science, policy, and management. And I'll be with you for the rest of the semester, the last third. This is the ecology section, and I have to say I admire you for, first of all, showing up at 8, and secondly, showing up when you have a midterm coming up next week for the evolution section. So the first couple lectures I hope are largely review. We're going to cover what I would call physical geography, which is sort of the environment that organisms find themselves in. And we're going to look at why we see similarities of organisms around the Earth. Today we're going to talk about dispersal, why organisms look like other organisms in different places because they've dispersed there. Next time we'll talk about vicariance, which I'll explain later, which is organisms that are there where they are because of the land underneath them. Okay. So let me just spend a few minutes on logistics. My department, ESPM, office hours Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday at 9 to 10. So right after this class on Monday and Wednesday, and then Tuesday also. And then just so that if those times don't work for you, I picked another time that I thought would be quite different, Thursday from 2 to 3. And if all those times don't work for you, I'm happy to meet at some other point too. But let's see how those go. I have a separate email that's just for this class, and I get a lot of email because of what I do for our department. So if you send it to this email, it goes to one mailbox, and I'll do my best to respond to those within the day. The topics I've organized in this way, the environment, the first 2 lectures, then we'll talk about populations, and we'll talk about ecological communities, and then finally ecosystems and global biology. And this largely fits the outline of the book. However, the book has one section at the end which is all about how we apply this stuff and how it relates to the world, and I prefer to put some of that into each lecture. And so I'll draw a little bit from the last part of the book as we go. And as you'll see, I've organized my lectures. They're all the same way. Maybe a little bit boring in the organization, but I think it'll help you. There's an outline, you'll see this in a minute, with reading from our textbook, and there's also a syllabus with a list of reading that's on the website. Each day, I'm going to give you a video that I'd like you to look at before you come to class, and I'm hoping that we can, just 5 minutes or 3 minutes, and I'm hoping that we can use that to have some discussion. I sort of feel that if you take the effort to come here at 8 o'clock, at least we'll make it enjoyable for you. And also I feel that you're going to learn the most if you show up here and listen compared to watching at home, which of course is fine as well. In the lectures, we'll try to cover general concepts. We'll look at case studies. They're sort of classic studies in ecology that you should know about. We'll also look at examples that deal with health. Many of you are pre-health or you're planning to go on to health professions, and ecology relates to health in many, many ways, especially with respect to disease and the human condition. And then finally, examples for California, because that is where we are, and it's fun to think about that. For each lecture, I have a section called Bear Profs, where I'll give you a list of professors at Berkeley who are doing this kind of work for their own research, and it's a way for you to figure out whom you might contact if you want to work in their laboratories. And then finally, a list of terms and concepts, which I won't go over in the lecture, but they're there at the end of each lecture, and you know that if you've looked already. And then questions, feel free to ask them at any time. I'm supposed to repeat them. I might ask you your name. I'd like to learn some of your names. But feel free to ask. I'll ask you questions. I'll ask you some questions today. But you can ask me questions anytime. Okay. I know that many of you took AP Bio in high school, and so we'll try not to repeat that. We're going to focus more on the concepts and less on just memorizing, because I know there's a lot of memorizing. And then just to point out that office hours, I think, are largely unappreciated. Very few people actually come to office hours. Come by. We can talk about this. We can talk about your roommate. We can talk about careers in science, really whatever you like. Okay. The midterm for this section, I know you don't want to think about another midterm, but for this section, the midterm and the final are both on the same day, which is May 11th. So the first hour will be the midterm for the ecology part, and then the last 2 hours, the final exam. And what you need to know for this section anyway is everything. We're going to focus mostly on the lectures, but I do expect you to read the book. It's not difficult. It's about 9 pages total for every lecture, and when you take out the questions at the end, maybe 4 or 5 pages for every lecture. And I view the book mostly as background, not that you have to memorize it, but especially if you don't get what I'm trying to tell you here, you can look in the book and see that. And then also the lab materials, especially the write-ups, the documents that we give you before the lab that introduce it. There's some material in there as well, especially in the later labs. And then, like the other professors, I'll post some sample questions, and we'll have review sessions. Okay, that's a lot of bookkeeping. So here we go. Each lecture, I'll start off with a slide like this, and it's in your on B courses for you. The pages that you're supposed to read, a video that I'd like you to look at, and if we have time at the end, I can play that video. This one has to do with Governor Brown and his statement just recently saying that we're going to mandate a 25% cut in water use in California. And this is really interesting, and it's very relevant to biology and to health and everything we do. What's interesting is that doesn't include agriculture, which we can talk about. And here's one of the slides or the graphics that go along with that video that show the snowpack. And here you can see the snowpack in the last 4 or 5 years is really, really low, and a record low compared to all the time that they've been keeping records since the 1950s. And I start each lecture just reviewing where we were last time. You just finished the evolution section with Professor Schabel. You've got an exam coming up. Today we're going to talk about ecology, the importance of the environment, a little bit about topography and distribution of organisms, and we're going to focus today on dispersal, and we're going to contrast that with what you'll learn about next time having to do with vicariance. And that leads us into biogeography next time. Okay, any questions about the format or what's expected? We're good? All right. So here we go. The other thing I like to do is walk around, sort of Phil Donahue style. So I'm going to do that. And who knows what this animal is? Actually, you probably know if you've looked at the notes. Does anyone know? A badger. Who said that? And what's your name? Morning. So do you know where this was taken? Or can you guess where badgers are from? In where? Sierra Nevadas. Yeah. Well, this is actually from Washington State. But I'm using these sets of organisms to give you a feeling for how animals and plants and organisms are adapted to their environment. And you've learned a lot about adaptation already through adaptation through the process of natural selection. And we'll talk about other kinds of ways that organisms can live in the environment as well. So these are already come pre-labeled, so I guess I won't ask you what those are. That's a bed bug. Has anyone ever seen a bed bug? No, they're actually not that big. They're kind of, a couple millimeters big. But they make their living, of course, living on you. And they're becoming a serious problem here in the Bay Area, largely in hotels, but also in your houses. And they're quite difficult to get rid of. They come out at night and feed on you, and then during the day, they go in and hide under your mattresses and in your curtains. But they're highly adapted, as you can see, to being flat. You won't feel them if they're crawling on you, and they're also well camouflaged. The badger, it has some characteristics, too, for its environment. And you can see that it's got claws, it's digging, it's got fur that camouflages it to its habitat. On the lower right, there is a California tiger salamander. Has anyone ever seen one of those in California? Yeah? Where did you see it? Okay, you saw it in the woods. Not in the desert, though, right? So it's in a place where it has to have a moist or water area for its raising its young. Again, a very different kind of environment than the badger shown there. And then finally, mold on oranges. I'm sure you've seen mold, hopefully not too much. But mold, of course, is very highly specific to what it's growing on, in this case, an orange. But some molds, as you know, are very important, like penicillin and so on. And I just wanted to show you these to make you think about how these organisms are adapted to where they live. And one of the ways that you've heard about already is natural... Sorry, let me turn this on here. One of the ways that organisms become well suited to their habitats is through natural selection. And I hope you know a lot about that already. But there's also a way that organisms can live in environments and change with their environments, and that's called homeostasis. Which is the idea that organisms can maintain some balance between them and the conditions that they're living in by changing themselves within a generation. So it's not natural selection, it's not genetic, but it's just a way of being adaptable in the plasticity kind of sense. And this homeostasis can be morphological. For example, if that badger gets longer fur in the colder seasons, that's a change that's you will see in its morphology, but it's not necessarily a genetic change. It can be physiological. A second here. For example, if there's less food or more food, the animals or plants can respond accordingly, and also, at least for animals, behavioral. Okay. When we think about ecology, we think about sort of levels of organization. So ecology itself, ecology is the study of organisms, of course, and their environments. And this was a term that was coined by Ernst Haeckel. If I get that, let me just check the spelling on that. Haeckel. In 1866. You don't have to remember the date, but the name is important. And ecology is from a Greek word, oikos, which means house or home. And ology is just the study of. Sorry about that. Okay. And we think of ecology. Whoops, let me get through these things here. When we think of the study of ecology, we think of levels of organization or hierarchical ways to think about life. So there's a prairie dog there, which we might think of as badger food. And we can study the ecology of that organism as an individual, how it responds to the environment, how it itself gives birth, lives, and dies. And then if we have groups of individuals or groups of organisms, we call that a population. So a population is a group of organisms of the same species, typically interbreeding, but not necessarily so. And then if we have groups of populations that are interacting, that is just the biology part, predator-prey, competitors of different species interacting, that is a community. And then when we add the environmental component, that's the ecosystem. So if we have a set of organisms interacting in a community and we put them in an environmental setting, we call that the ecosystem. And then the next level up is the one of the biosphere, that is the whole Earth and all the biology that's found there. And some people also distinguish a landscape scale between the ecosystem and the biosphere. So you might have sets of ecosystems, for example, in Yosemite, ranging from grasslands to the mountains, and you put those together, and you might think of that as a landscape. Well, there are other kinds of ecosystems, too, or other kinds of systems. Let me just write down the word system. And we could also look within any of these organisms, and we'd find a whole other set of populations, a set of communities, in fact, even an ecosystem. And as you know, our own stomachs are filled with microorganisms that are very diverse, and we'll talk some about the biology of those organisms and disease later. And then we can also think of systems that include, people and how people interact with the natural ecosystems. We might think of the Cal campus as a community. It's certainly a set of interacting organisms. There's environment involved, there's foraging, and so on. So we can think of ecology as a hierarchy of these different systems and how organisms are interacting with their environment. Much of what we think of in terms of our environment has to do with the weather, what it's like outside. So the weather is really just the conditions of temperature and precipitation that are happening today. And our weather in San Francisco area is very characteristic. We have a lot of fog. We also have some sunny days. And if we look at the patterns of weather over a year, we can see trends that go up and down, and we call those, of course, the seasons. And we can portray patterns of temperature and precipitation over the year in a graph, sometimes called a climograph or a climate diagram, a climate graph. And here's one for San Francisco. And these typically show temperature on one side and precipitation on the other. And the scale isn't really important, but what is important is how temperature and precipitation vary over time and how they don't vary in the same way over time. So this is very characteristic of a Mediterranean climate, which we'll talk about next time. So in San Francisco, as you know, we have periods of rain usually in the wintertime and then almost no rain in the summer, although we have some fog. And our temperature, shown here in red, actually varies very little across the year. And it's important that you understand these diagrams, and I'll show you a few more. Another reason to know about those diagrams is that if you're traveling and you look in the Lonely Planet Guide, you'll see these kinds of diagrams, and it's quite useful to know when in the year you're going to have rain and when it'll be sunny. Question?
Could you clarify the difference between climate and weather?
Okay, so her question, what's the difference between climate and weather? So weather is what's happening at any point in time. It's the atmospheric conditions at any point in time. And climate is the average of those over some period. Okay, well, let me show you one for New York. So here on the right is a climate diagram for New York. And what's interesting is that in any given month, they get about the same as we do in any month in the wintertime. But they're also getting in New York rain throughout the year. Those are the blue bars. And their temperature, unlike ours, is it varies a lot through the year. So in New York, so I have to use this gizmo thing to point so you can see it at home. But I didn't mean to do that. You can see this red line here going up and down. That's the temperature, and it's changing a lot. It's hot in New York in the summertime and cold in the wintertime. Okay. And then let me show you one more. Here is Mangalore, India, which is a tropical region. And this is really interesting because their rainfall, like ours, is clustered just in one time of the year. They get the rainfall in their summertime. But what's also interesting is their weather or their temperature is hot So here this graph has reversed the axes, but the temperature here between 25 and 30 degrees all year round, and the rainfall, some serious rain, of course, in their summertime. And your book calls this a monsoon pattern. We call this a Mediterranean climate where we are. And this monsoon is created because these continental regions can get so hot, and because of the uplift, and they can pull, and the low pressure, they can pull moisture from the oceans and create just huge amounts of rain at certain times of the year. We also get monsoon patterns in the southwest U.S., in southern Arizona, for example, when it gets very hot in the central U.S., and that can pull moisture from the Gulf of California up into the southwest. Okay, so the point here, climate, seasonality, weather, and you should understand that depending on these different patterns of precipitation through the year and temperature through the year, we're going to get very different kinds of organisms, and we'll talk more about that next lecture as well. All right, well, next I'm going to talk about patterns of wind and ocean currents. And as we will see later in this semester too, all of this is driven by the sun. So the sun here, I didn't mean to do that one yet. Sorry. This is super confusing. There we go. So the sun is what's important in driving the winds, and the winds drive the ocean patterns. And we'll see later in the semester the importance of sun for primary productivity as well. Okay, so we know that the sun hits the Earth, and at the equator this is most intense. And as the Earth tilts on its axis during the year, the sunlight hits the Earth in a slightly different way. And what's interesting here is that the sunlight hitting the Earth more towards the pole at a different angle of incidence, it's called, has a number of effects. One is that towards the pole, the sunlight is actually going through more of the atmosphere. So let's try this here. So here, down here, when the sunlight is going through the atmosphere here and hitting the Earth, it's actually going through more atmosphere because the Earth is tilted, and so the sunlight is going at an angle through more of the atmosphere. And you know this, when the sun is setting, for example, it's a lot less intense than when it is at the top. And it's also the case that down here, closer to the poles, the sunlight is spread over a larger surface area because the Earth is sloped away from the sun down here at the bottom. Anyway, so as a result of these two things, the sunlight hitting the Earth is more intense at the equator than at the poles. All right. Okay, and when the Earth rotates around the sun, and you know already from previous studies that the Earth is tilted, as a result of this, parts of the Earth receive more sun at different times of the year than other parts of the Earth. And what this means is that you get a lot of variation in temperature anyway as you get farther from the poles, or farther from the equator, sorry. So as you get closer to the poles, you get more variation in temperature seasonally, right? In the tropics, it's shown here at 0 latitude. It's roughly the same temperature all year round. And as you get closer to the poles, either north or south, you get more variation in temperature because the summers are hotter and the winters are colder. And this graph shows differences between the northern latitudes and the southern latitudes. The southern latitudes, as you know, there's a lot more ocean than in the northern latitudes. And so the variation seasonally is less in the southern latitudes than the northern latitudes. And we'll come back to this again when we talk about primary productivity. Any questions here? This should be largely review. You're probably wondering where this is leading. Okay, it's leading to this. And the point here is that the sun drives these big patterns of air circulation around the Earth. That's important in determining where on Earth we have a lot of rain and a lot of drought. And it also determines the direction of these, what we call prevailing winds. And it's those winds that drive the ocean currents. Okay, I'm going to explain a little bit about this figure over here. Okay, here's the Earth, here's the equator, north and south, and the sun is here. All right, so what this figure is showing that as the sun heats up the equator, where the intensity of light and heat will be most intense, it will heat the air, and the air will rise. And that's those red arrows turning into blue. Air is rising at the equator. And as the air rises, it cools, and it can't hold as much moisture, and so that moisture falls back to Earth as precipitation. And so that's why at the equator, at that region, you have more rain, and why it's wetter in tropical regions. Okay, so the air is up in the atmosphere, and it's cold, and it needs someplace to go, and eventually it returns to Earth. And as it returns to Earth, it warms up and can absorb more moisture. And it just so happens that it's returning to Earth around 30 degrees north and south. And so when it's returning to Earth, it's heating up, gaining more moisture, and so those places on Earth where the air is coming back to Earth are drier. And that's shown in that figure too. And so that's why it's the case that all the major deserts and dry areas are typically at 30 degrees north and south latitude. All right. And then some of that air comes back towards the equator along the edge of the Earth itself, and some is going in the other direction. And it turns out there's another one of these large air circulation patterns that starts at about 60 degrees, and some of it goes up there, and also the same down below. And what this figure should have shown is that the extent to which the air moves up into the air because of the effect of the sun is actually much greater at the equator than it is at the pole. So those circulation graphs at the poles actually should be a lot smaller. They shouldn't go as far up into the atmosphere as they do at the equator. Okay, so the point is lots of sun at the equator, so these air circulation cells are really large. The air comes back down at 30 degrees north and south, heats up, absorbs moisture, and that's why you have the deserts at those areas. Okay, the next thing to explain is the prevailing winds and the pattern of prevailing winds. And this is a bit complicated, and I think your book does a good job of explaining this. But the way to think about it, I think, is that relative to the speed of the Earth, the air can either move faster or slower than the Earth's rotation. And the other thing to remember is that the Earth, at least around the equator, in terms of latitude, is the biggest at the equator. And the latitude rings are smaller and smaller as you get to the poles. So the winds that are coming back from these desert regions to the equator, from 30 degrees north and south back to the equator, they're actually having to traverse a larger distance as they get closer to the equator. So they start out at 30 degrees north and south. It's a pretty small ring at 30 degrees north and south latitude, and the equator is a much bigger circle. And so they actually have to traverse a larger distance, and as a result, they appear to slow down compared to the spin of the Earth. So the winds at this latitude, north and south, are moving in that direction, and that's why those arrows for the prevailing winds go in that direction. And the reverse is true for the winds that are moving northward from 30 degrees. So these winds, they're starting at 30 degrees north, but they're moving to a smaller latitude even farther north, and so they actually speed up relative to the spin of the Earth. So they're moving in that direction. So you get patterns, you get circulation patterns of winds in these different areas, and that's really important, as we'll see in a second, for driving these patterns of water circulation. Okay, how are we doing? Is this completely confusing? Any questions about this? Yeah. Yeah, I'll take that back. So they would be higher. So these are surface winds. Yeah, I'll take those out so it's not confusing. So the surface winds are moving in this direction. These are the winds that are at higher altitudes. All right, so let me just summarize where we are. Lots of heat at the equator. Because of that heat at the equator, we get winds, or we get air masses rising, dumping the water. That's why we have moisture at the equator. When they come back down to Earth, they're absorbing moisture, and so we have deserts at 30 degrees north and south. Those winds have to go somewhere. If the winds from 30 degrees are coming back to the equator, it's a larger distance around the equator than at 30 degrees, and so those winds are slowing down a little bit. If the winds are moving northward, it's a smaller distance towards the poles. They're speeding up a bit. And that's what creates these patterns of prevailing winds on Earth. Are we good? All right. Well, the prevailing winds moving in this way are driving the ocean currents. And if you sort of visualize these wind patterns and you plop those on the oceans, you can see that these ocean currents are, in fact, following the winds that are above. And I just would like you to remember just a few currents here. So you can see what's happening in the, just a second here. Let's just look at the North Pacific here. You can see that these, because of these prevailing winds, you get these what we call gyres of big masses of water moving around the Pacific. And if you've seen the movie Finding Nemo, you know all about this. And in the southern hemisphere, you see the same thing, but moving in the other direction. And this is really important for biology and for nutrients and productivity, which we'll come back to. And along our coast here in North America, we have a current coming down because of this gyre. We have a current coming down here from Alaska, and that's called the California current, and that's a cold current. And I'd like you to remember that name and that current. We'll come back to that. On the East Coast, we have a gyre moving in this direction, and the Gulf Stream is the main current along the East Coast. That's a warm current because it's coming from the Caribbean. And then the only other current I'd like you to remember is there's a current that's going actually along Antarctica. And it's not, this figure doesn't show it that well because it also shows a current that's closer to the shore going in the other direction. But that's also a current I'd like you to remember, this Antarctic circumpolar current that's actually spinning all the way around at the bottom of the Earth. Okay. So I'd like you to remember these three currents: California current, a cold current coming down from Alaska, really important for our fisheries, which we'll talk about. The Gulf Stream, a warm current coming from the Caribbean, and the Antarctic circumpolar current, which is actually going unhindered all the way around the Earth, below South America and below Australia. Okay, are we good on that? So I don't expect you to memorize all those currents. Just know that the winds, the prevailing winds, are driving the directions of these currents in the ocean. And both of these patterns of circulation, both for the winds and the oceans, make predictions about where we would expect organisms to be. If organisms are being dispersed by winds or by the ocean currents, then we'd expect them to move around the world following these currents. And it's that kind of dispersal, actually, that I study, largely in collaboration with my wife, Rosie Gillespie, and I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about that. Well, one more thing first. Sorry, I forgot this. In addition to these global patterns of winds and precipitation, there are also more local patterns that are caused by the shape of the Earth or the topography. And the topography also matters. I think we're in a great spot to see that here in the Bay Area. Here's a graph actually from your book showing the Pacific Ocean and the winds coming from the ocean moving uphill. And as we talked about before, as air rises, it can't hold as much moisture, so it dumps that moisture right here in Berkeley or in Marin County or in Santa Cruz. And then on the other side of the hills here, as you know, in Walnut Creek and Orinda, it's a lot drier. So the Central Valley is dry because the winds have gone uphill and have dumped the moisture before they got to the Central Valley. We call that a rain shadow. And this rain shadow effect is really pronounced in California, in fact, the whole western U.S. So here's a map of California. We have the winds coming from the west. They have to go over the Coast Range and then over the hills here in Berkeley. And as a result, shown here is in different colors is the amount of rain. But you can see as the rain goes over these mountains by Santa Cruz here shown here's Santa Cruz area, and then Marin County area, and then even farther north in Humboldt. You can see that the rain is falling on these regions because of the topography there. The rise in the mountains, the rain gets dumped on those mountains. And then on the other side, shown here in the Central Valley, and then just over the hill in Orinda and Walnut Creek, it gets a lot drier. And we see the same thing here in the Sierras. Here are the Sierras, shown in blue, as the winds bring precipitation over the Sierras. There, again, the air is forced to rise. It cools. Colder air can't hold as much moisture, so it dumps rain and hopefully snow in the Sierras. And then on the other side, it's dry. We have a desert. And we see this again also in the Rockies here through the middle of the western U.S., where the air has to go over the Rockies, and what's left of all that precipitation gets dumped on the Rockies, and then over on the other side of the Rockies, again, it's quite dry. All right. So back to these predictions. So we have now a set of patterns of wind currents and ocean currents, and we know a little bit about topography, and we can hypothesize that if organisms are dispersing to get to new habitats, then we ought to be able to detect that. And not only that, but the mechanisms of dispersal that match either wind movements or water currents, we ought to be able to pick that up as well. So I've been involved in a number of studies looking at especially invasive species across the Hawaiian Islands. And as you are probably aware, the Hawaiian Islands were colonized not that many times by all kinds of different things, including Hawaiian honey creepers here for Hawaii, spiders, silver sword plants that Bruce Baldwin works on at Berkeley. You know about the Galapagos and the Galapagos finches, and we'll return to the Galapagos finches in later lectures. So we can ask, well, what predictions can we make? Where did the organisms come from that are found on these islands? And we can predict that, well, if they dispersed by air, then they ought to come from places predicted by these wind currents. If they came through ocean currents, then they ought to have come from places predicted by the ocean currents. Topography is also important, even in the Pacific. So here, for example, is a map showing the amount of precipitation across the islands of Hawaii, the Big Island here on the lower right. And you can see that parts of these islands are wetter than others, and this is predicted by the prevailing winds that are bringing moisture and winds across the Pacific. When they hit these islands, the air again rises and dumps moisture, but only on certain sides of the island. So on some sides of the island, you have wet, moist habitats. That's me, Rosie, and our kids some years ago. Our kids are now your age. In fact, some of you know them. And on the dry islands, dry part of the islands, you get habitats that look like this. They didn't turn out to be biologists, either of them, I should say. Too many field trips, I think, and not enough surfing. Okay. So if we look at the patterns of prevailing winds, shown in white, some storms, light blue, these big hurricanes, and the jet streams, we can make some predictions about where these organisms should have come.
It's just as spiderlings, they get out of the egg sac and then they will go up something like up to the top of a branch or something. And then they'll...
So, I'm going to start that over again out loud.
It's just as spiderlings, they get out of the egg sac and then they will go up something like up to the top of a branch or something. And then they'll put their little abdomens up in the air and let silk out, and the wind will pull on the silk, and it'll pull more and more as they let more and more silk out, and then they'll finally take off, kind of like Mary Poppins takes off with her umbrella. And they'll just sail up into the air.
Okay, so for these spiders, maybe a little loud. For these spiders that are dispersing because they balloon by putting up a little piece of silk, their patterns of biogeography and their origins are predicted by these winds. They come from North America, as you might expect from the prevailing winds. The situation is a little bit different. The situation, wait, can't tell how loud I am. Can you hear me? Okay, the situation is, I can't tell if you can hear me. Is it good? Okay, the situation is a bit different for birds because birds not only are affected by winds, but some are migratory. And for migratory birds, some of them are using the Pacific Islands as stopping places on migrations from the Arctic, even sometimes to the Antarctic, but certainly across the Pacific. So some of the bird origins are predicted by these migratory pathways. Many of the forest birds, however, show a lot of affinities with the Americas, and it's thought that this comes as a result of these flyways of birds up and down the Pacific coast. And it's likely that through storms or somehow these birds got pushed out into the ocean accidentally once in a while. And that's likely what is responsible for the birds that have come into these islands in the Pacific, like the Galapagos finches and the birds in Hawaii, and cause these adaptive radiations shown there above. And in Hawaii, some of these are really dramatic. This is a set of Hawaiian honey creepers that are actually related to the North American cedar waxwings, and it's a great example of adaptive radiation, which you talked about already in your evolution section. Okay. These birds that come from the north and the south and use these islands for flyways are also bringing other organisms. So, for example, the birds eat seeds, and if they haven't pooped out those seeds before they get to the islands, then it's a way of dispersing those plants. And it's also a way of dispersing organisms that are feeding inside those seeds. And so it turns out that many of the moths that are seed feeders in these islands, like Hawaii, were probably dispersed inside these seeds and inside birds from the northern, from boreal regions into the Pacific. You don't have to remember all these details. This is just background information. The ocean currents also make some predictions for intertidal organisms and also for those organisms that raft on big mats of vegetation that sometimes get dislodged and move across the Pacific. And here are just some examples. That one picture there, the lower right photo, is an example of a mat of vegetation that's floating in the Caribbean, and researchers actually found lizards on that mat. And that's how some of these bigger organisms, there's a beetle that moved across the Pacific and a very large spider that moved to the northwest Hawaiian Islands. That's probably how these big, large animals that don't fly, how they're able to get to some of these remote islands. For good or bad, other things are moving around the Pacific and the Atlantic. and other oceans of the world. There's a lot of trash. There's a lot of trash in these oceans, as you might be aware, and the trash also accumulates into these big mats, and it's a place where many organisms, especially invasive species, can live and disperse around the world. And scientists are actively studying these mats of vegetation, in this case, largely human-caused debris masses, as a way to understand dispersal patterns of organisms around the Earth. And probably the best example of this the best example of this is a boatload of Nike sneakers that accidentally fell overboard in the 1990s. And also another example is a tub of plastic toys. And there's a group of people, it's a citizen science group, that's tracking these sorts of things around the Earth. So here, for example, are the sneakers. They fell off a boat here in the northern Pacific, number 1 there, in 1990. And then they were found months later and then years later here in Hawaii and also back in Asia as a result of these currents. And scientists actually use this information as a way to figure out how these currents take place and how marine organisms can live and be dispersed at such great distances throughout the Earth. Okay, so some of the people who do this work at Berkeley, in case you're interested in more of this kind of thing, that's Rosie Gillespie, my wife, and also a professor in ESPM, and she studies spiders and community biology. Bruce Baldwin, who's in integrated biology, and he works on plants, especially silver swords and their relatives in Hawaii. Ian Wong, a new professor in ESPM who works on landscape ecology and distributions of vertebrates, especially in California, including salamanders and lizards. And I work on insects and invasions. Okay. And then I just want to point this out before I let you go. So at the end of each lecture, I'll have the terms and concepts that I expect you to know. Most of these are in the book. Some are not in the book, and when they're not in the book, I try to write them on the board. But this is the set of things that I really expect you to know for each lecture. Okay, good luck on Wednesday, and we'll see you next week.